What even is poetry? What is poetry? What even is poetry? What's poetry? I get so many people telling me that they don't write poetry, or they can't write poetry, or they don't like poetry. I think the reason so many people hate poetry is because what we believe poetry isn't what poetry actually is. When we're at school, we get taught about poetry, and it is lines and stanzas, and it's how to make things rhyme, and it's how to read into metaphors, going deep into every single meaning of every single word. We spend our whole time at school pulling apart poems, trying to find the meaning of the poetry. I don't think anything you can write could be poetry. I don't think any of the poems that I've really written really are poetry. I don't believe any poems are poetry. I believe in you as a poet, but poetry for me is something different. It's not the words on the page. I think as poets, we get so caught up on the words on the page, or as people and writers, we get so caught up on the words on the page and how it has to be poetry, and it's not poetry. It's never going to be poetry, because poetry doesn't live in the words. It doesn't live in the page. Poetry lives out there. Poetry is in the way that shadow and light plays together. Poetry is in the way that leaves move in the wind. Poetry is in the way that I feel when someone breaks my heart. Poetry is in the way two complete strangers lock eyes and for a moment realize that somebody else is living deep in their own experience at the same exact moment of them. That's poetry. What we write on the page isn't poetry. Now, our job as poets, my job as a poet, I feel like, and as an artist, is to take in poetry, not to put it out, to take in poetry, to let myself be so full of poetry, to witness things, to see poetry, to smell poetry, to taste poetry, to pull poetry into every single part of my being until the only thing that's left, until I'm so full of that poetry that the only place left for it to go is on the page. Now that is poetry, not what's on the page, but what we filled ourselves with, what we have filled our very being with, to be able to get the words onto the page. So if you've ever said that you can't write poetry, or that you don't write poetry, or that nothing that you write is poetry, that's okay, because nothing that anybody writes is really poetry. Poetry is what's out there. Your job isn't to write poetry. Your job is to be filled with poetry, to let life fill you with its poetry, and just let out whatever needs to come. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, then give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and if you feel like it, leave me a message in the comments and let me know what poetry means to you.